darkmyths.org, Minneapolis Media Group, proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
Oh, hi there. What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Lone Gunman Podcast. Yeah, you heard that right. Your boy is back, and hopefully in full effect. We shall see. Got an exciting show for you today, and I'm just going to let y'all know a little bit about where I've been for a second, and, y'all knew about the last show last March, and that was supposed to be it, but with the release of all these files and all this new information that's coming to light and all the good work that people are doing, I'm reinvigorated, I'm reinterested, and I'm back, bitches. Okay, so without further ado, I wanted to bring on my old buddy from Dealey Plaza, UK, and prayerman.com, prayer-man.com, my old buddy Bart Camp. How's it going, man?
I'm doing very good. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm very happy, actually, that you've gone back at it. And hopefully many more shows to follow with interesting talks about this huge enigma called the JFK assassination.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's November already this year. I mean, it's like, damn, it's already November. And I know you've been working hard. I know you've been laid up for a while. You've had a lot of time to pour through everything, to do a lot of work on this stuff. And just a little aside for the listeners out there, like me and Bart love to gross each other out sometimes. We'll send each other videos of these huge, pimples being popped and, these gnarly cysts being drained. And
sebaceous cysts.
Yeah. Well, Bart won this past summer when he sent me a photo of his foot. It was disgusting. I've never seen anything so disgusting in my life, and it looks hella painful, dude. So hopefully you're back on the mend.
Yeah, I am. Actually, let's just start since our last conversation that we had about the second floor lunchroom encounter last year in September, which actually, if I'm not mistaken, is your best listened show. Most downloads, most listens.
You are correct.
A long shot, actually. I think it's about 2,000 more than any of the others. So I was quite chuffed with that. What happened then after that was that Stu Wexler of JFK Lancer, during the conference, contacted me through Facebook Messenger and said, congratulations. And I was like, for what? And he goes, you've got an award. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And he goes, no, seriously. We've given you an award for your paper on the second floor lunchroom encounter. And I was like, oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, how cool is that? I mean, congratulations. It's been a kick-ass year, for you and JFK research-wise, definitely.
It was really good, and I was quite chuffed about that. And I started writing about the next one around Christmas last year. I had nothing better to do, so I started putting things together regarding the interrogations, which we're going to talk about tonight. And then in April, I got another award from Dealey Plaza UK for the same essay as such. And then after that, I released an update on the second floor lunchroom encounter, which was about, 20 odd pages, maybe 30. And I did another update while I was in hospital, because I was admitted in hospital in June. And for some reason, I was operated 11 times on my right foot. And and I was also on heavy sedation. I took a lot of morphine, fluid, and also a tablet called, which is a slow release type of morphine as well. And
that's the good stuff.
Well, to an extent, it takes care of the pain, definitely. but at the same time, I lost interest in about everything except the paper I was working on, and that was the interrogations one. I was just like, well, I've got nothing else to do, and I wasn't really watching a lot of TV, and I couldn't get into reading books for some reason, so I just started doing the essay instead. The essay itself became just over 300 pages. And right now, I've had in this period of time since the release in September and until now, so we're talking just over 2 months, I've added about 20 odd pages to it for a next update as such. So in a way, the hospitalization of myself, the only positive thing about that whole matter was that I basically put all my energy towards putting that paper together. And the thing was also that I really overlooked how big it actually is. And this is also the reason why I asked, can we do this in 2 episodes? Because the second floor lunchroom encounter one is at this point about, on top of my head, about 135 pages. But this one right now is 328.
Whew.
So it's a bit much to discuss this within the hour. And the bit that I focused on at first was actually the participants that were involved in the interrogation and involved with Oswald's transfer between his cell and the interrogation room and the lineups as such. But then, of course, there's also the whole legal matter. And that's what roughly about the last 100 pages are about. And they, by itself, are quite an interesting subject. A lot of people know about certain bits, but I managed to get hands on some of the documents that I doubt a lot of people have seen before. So I thought, well, to give them, to do that justice, I think it's better to discuss that in the second half. First half is basically about the, as I said, about the participants. Well, why don't I just kick off right away from the beginning about the setting? So Oswald's basically arrested in a Texas theater, and Jerry Hill and a few of his colleagues drive Oswald to City Hall, where there's obviously there's footage of that video footage of Oswald with his shirt off his shoulders, being frog marched through the corridors and dropped off inside an interrogation room. There's also footage of Billy Lovelady actually sitting inside Captain Fritz's office while Oswald is basically being brought in. And this gets to quite an interesting beginning actually by itself, because the question is like, what actually happens with Oswald when he's seated down? And you get to who's actually interrogating Oswald. Now everybody thinks that Will Fritz was interrogating him, and he did. Of course, he did that. He was the main guy. But there are some discrepancies from the very beginning, because officially, Richard Stovall and Gus Rose are noted as the 2 people that actually not interrogate, but talk to Oswald as such. And there is already the first discrepancy being noted. Stovall says in his Warren Commission testimony that once asked by his name, he gives it as Lee Oswald, whereas Gus Rose says that he gives it as Alec Heidel. That by itself is quite a strange thing, but it becomes even weirder, and that's the fact that Joe Cody, who was also there, and Joe Cody is actually more famous for the fact that he sold the gun to Jack Ruby. Ruby was a friend of him, and the gun that he sold to Ruby was the gun that Ruby used to kill Oswald.
Oh,
and
wow.
And Cody himself actually says that he interrogated Oswald at the very beginning. So that is quite weird, odd. And but it gets even it even better. And that's the fact that Jim Lavelle, and Jim Lavelle is still alive. And Jim Lavelle actually starts talking in quite a few videos. I'm not going to talk about what video such and such. I mean, you have to download the paper either at my site or at the Dealey Plaza UK site. It will take a while to load since it's 300 something pages. And in that, I basically point out that that Lavelle makes several claims that he basically interrogated Oswald, but only with regards to the Tippit murder as such. That is quite interesting because if you look at the early documentation of Lavelle, he makes absolutely no mention of this so-called interrogation whatsoever. And I get the feeling that Lavelle is fibbing, or better yet, lying about the fact that he interrogated Oswald. You see, Lavelle wasn't there at that time because he was sent out immediately. And same with Stovall and Rose, they were sent out to Ruth Paine.
Right.
So if you had to believe all these people, then before Fritz actually gets to talk to him, Cody, Stovall, Rose, and Lavelle all talk to Oswald just before. And especially Lavelle cannot be supported at all with any documentation, as I basically said. So then Fritz basically gets hold of him. Now, Fritz comes back from the Texas School Book Depository with Elmer Boyd. And there's a picture of Fritz leaving, he's on the front steps, and Boyd has got a rifle. And they're basically being... and they make it back to the Dallas police station after 2 o'clock. And Fritz starts interrogating Oswald around that time. Fritz himself doesn't use a tape recorder. Now, although you could condemn him for that, it wasn't really the practice of the Dallas police to do that because, first of all, they didn't have one. And according to Fritz's Warren Commission testimony, he said that he put in a quest twice, and twice it was denied as such.
Yeah, it'd be nice if we had some audio of Oswald actually being interrogated.
I think the whole thing would fall apart like a deck of cards. You know, it's just I've read on Bill Kelly's site that there are apparently FBI recordings as such. I've asked him. I haven't gotten an answer. I wonder whether that's actually true. The FBI in the agents of the FBI, which are Jim Hosty and Jim Bookhout. Now, Bookhout was the liaison between the DPD and the FBI, and he was practically there almost every day. Bookhout was there when Oswald was brought in, whereas Hosty came in later. Hosty roughly came in at 2:45. And that's a whole story by itself, and I actually should mention this a little bit. It's like a sub-chapter in my paper. Hosty walks in and gets into the basement, the same basement where Oswald gets shot 48 hours later, less than 48 hours later. And he walks up to Jack Revel, who's criminal intelligence. And he said, like, you know, who did it? Oh, we got this guy called Oswald. And he says, like, I knew it, that it was him. And also, he said, like, what's more important, he says, like, that he was capable of killing Oswald. Now, that last bit is in dispute. It's a hot dispute by everyone. But what happens is that Revel tells Captain Ganaway about this. And Ganaway says, write a report about this. So on that very same day, there's a report written about the fact that the FBI has said that A, it was on their radar, and B, it was capable of killing. And that report gets the DPD into hot water with Hoover. Hoover calls Shanklin, and, oh, sorry, I've got to add, the fact that Jesse Curry tells this in front of the press, makes it even worse. So A, the report, but B, the fact that blabbermouth Jesse Curry just starts yapping to the press about this, that the FBI was aware of Oswald and the tendencies that he was a dangerous criminal who could kill. Is basically gets Hoover on the phone right away, and he calls Shanklin and he says, I want a retraction. And he threatens with everything that is in his power. And so Shanklin calls Curry, and Curry eventually does a sort of retraction as such, not fully apologize, but he does say like, yeah, you know, I talk too much, blah, 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 blah. And that's also one of Hoover's main complaints about the whole thing, is the fact that the press is everywhere. And as you can see from all the videos that are present on YouTube or in my channel, the Lone Gunman channel, it's evident that the press, you got to remember this, you've got a really tiny corridor, and there is one of the offices is just like a door with a large window in it where everybody can look through. And then if you walk in there and you go to the right after about 15, 20 feet, you've got a smaller office, and that's where Fritz and Oswald and other law enforcement agency representatives are busy interrogating Oswald. And the world press is basically just outside that room, which is room 317. I've got a diagram also in the beginning of that paper that shows exactly where it's at. And you can't even imagine something like that in the present day, nor anywhere else. I mean, it'd be something out of a Hollywood film, yeah, with all the drama. But this is exactly what happened. And even when Oswald arrived, there was already various representatives of the press already there. But when you look at it like later that day, the evening, and also the next day, then you see like these massive television cameras, which are the equivalent of the ones that are used in the present day. I mean, the present day ones are even smaller, but we're talking about these massive tripods on wheels. And this corridor is...
They have in studios now.
Yes, exactly. And they had them on location. You see, now people have portable equipment, and you can get good quality video with a small camera these days. But back then, those things weighed a ton. And they were just blocking up the whole corridor. And in the end, there was about 150 to 200 press people in that corridor. And you can really see this while Oswald is basically being transported and escorted by the Dallas police from his cell back to either to a lineup or back to his cell as such. Now, I just want to go back to Fritz. Fritz himself didn't use, as I said, he didn't use a tape recorder. But what he did do is prepare a long statement. Now, the funny thing is about the statement is that the statement isn't even signed, or is actually says that it is done by him as such. But since there's no one else who did these interrogations in such detail, and also what he writes about, it can be easily assumed that it was written by Fritz. And of course, there are the notes. The notes are the so-called interrogation notes, which are hand scribbled, where, of course, there are quite some important bits about Oswald's whereabouts during the assassination and just before the assassination. He said he was in the domino room, and more importantly, he says that he's out front. He's out with Bill Shelley in front. And what a lot of people think is that these notes were made during the interrogation, but they're not, because they're not contemporary, because at some point he starts talking about the deceased, for instance. So it's safe to assume that there might be part of it written down on the 22nd, but there's definitely stuff written down on the 24th or the 25th. And some of that then basically got used in this type report as such.
Well, I can tell you this, Bart, just from looking at that Fritz's notes thing, just in order to refute that asshat Ralph Zinke. I actually found in his Warren Commission testimony where Fritz pretty much told him that he did not take notes during the interrogation, that those notes came like 3 days afterwards. After Oswald was killed, he decided he better start writing down what he had talked about, or how the interrogation went before he forgot, so that he could, have them.
No, he was an old man, and he'd already had a 40-odd year career inside the Dallas Police Department. Here's the thing about Fritz. Fritz had his own fiefdom, basically. He was his own, tyrant is a really harsh, but he was running the show, and he didn't like to be told by anyone, definitely not by the chief of police or anyone, how to run an investigation. But what's more important, this week, I just, for the hell of it, because I posted a link to an article from the Dallas Observer that was writing about the documents that have been released recently. And in that, and Greg Parker mentioned this because I overlooked it for some reason. Go strap in, all of you. But Fritz had a 98% clearance rate. Now, he was robbery and homicide. Now, I looked up the crime rates, and in 1963, there were 113 murders, 488 robberies. Now, if we just look at the murders, and we just take 98%, you're looking at roughly, he's solving 2 murders a week. Now, 98%, when I hear 98%, I'm thinking Robert Mugabe about a election result, right?
Yeah.
Or like somebody in Belarus, a total dictator who's running the show, and then all of a sudden does or North Korea, for that matter, if there's an election of some sort, I compared it to a really dodgy election. Dallas police crime rates, solving them these days, hinges around the 50% marker. And I find it hard to believe that it was 98%, first of all, especially in relation to the 50% now, because you've got much better techniques, you've got much more technology at your disposal, and so forth, So, and that basically also coincides with the fact that the setting in the 60s, you see, I've said this before, you've got to try and look at this case through 1960s glasses, not 2017 glasses. And it's very important, what was the setting? And, lynching was a thing that was happening there. Racism was a major thing that was happening there. KKK were very popular. There was quite a few members of the Dallas police that were members of the KKK as such. And what also is being written about is Fritz, and I gave 2 examples in my paper about is violence towards suspects. Number one, most importantly, is Buell Frazier. Buell Frazier was interrogated, and he basically mentions this in the video. And I link everything I mentioned with regards to video and all that is in that paper. So you just have to click on it, and it will take you there. And Buell Frazier basically mentions that once he gets a statement just shoved in front of him that says that he's a co-conspirator, and he says, and Frazier at that time is a 19-year-old scared kid, and he at least had the wits to say, "I'm not going to sign that." After which, Will Fritz raises his hand to whack him one. And to which Frazier responded that he was going to have one hell of a fight. At that point, called out his office, and that's pretty much it. And then there is a bit about a black defendant, which is a few years before the assassination as such. And if I'm not, his name was Tommy Lee Walker. And he was actually convicted and sent to the electric chair as such. And Tommy Lee was brought before Captain Fritz, who questioned him for hours, not about any involvement in the robbery for which he had been arrested, but about a person called Venice Parker, who was murdered. And Tommy Lee said that Fritz told him that he had received a phone call implicating him in the crime, but Fritz had not received such a call at all. And he said that there were witnesses and that police knew what he had done. And Fritz was quite effective in getting admissions of guilt out of people. And his techniques worked in this case as well, because he basically threatened with violence from some of the other police officers. And he said that Fritz asked repeatedly if he had to bring the men in from upstairs, and when he balked at signing the confession. And he basically believed that the reference to the two officers he'd seen earlier beating a man. There's something I just want to investigate a little bit more, but even these two reports are already, worrying.
Yeah. Well, a quick question for you, Bart. I know that we ran across before that Buell Fraser's lie detector test results have been classified.
No, they're nowhere to be seen. They just don't know where they are.
No, they are. They're in NARA. I've seen the.
You've seen the listing?
I've seen the listing for it, but I don't know if they got released in the new files or not. I have not been able to check that yet. I didn't know if you'd run across them or not.
No, I haven't seen anything DPD related. The only thing I've seen is the majority of it is CIA. I went through the listings of 5,000 documents this morning and yesterday. I just kept scrolling.
I'll send that to you with the relevant numbers, and
I'd love to
see if you can find it.
I'd love to see that.
Okay.
I didn't know it was held at NARA. I thought it was just it disappeared, like many other documents. But that's really interesting. I'd love to see that.
It was still being held in full secret for national security purposes last time I checked on it.
Because the jig is up if it comes out, that's for sure. It's one of these things that if they show that, then it's the same as Roy Truly's deleted Warren Commission testimony. We were promised this a year ago, and we paid, I think it was $80 or $90 towards it. And there, you see, NARA has, you can get like photocopies and of the materials are there, but if they have something like, in this case, a dicta belt recording, you see, this is one thing you got to know, is that all the testimony was recorded, Victoria Adams, Roy Truly, Marion Baker, and so forth. And all these recordings pretty much disappeared. And by some crack in the web, there's a listing that Dennis Morissette pointed out to me last summer. The summer of 2016. He said, there's Roy Truly deleted testimony. And I go, why would there be deleted testimony? And we requested it. And the things that they can't copy, like a dicta belt recording, they're being sent off to trusted companies of NARA, and they basically make a digital copy of it for you. So they charge us $90. We paid it. They took the money of the credit card of my friend, and of an ROKC guy, and he basically said, we're going to have this in about 4 weeks. And then after 4 weeks, we inquired, and they said, then the people that were supposed to do the copy of it, they came back, and he said, I've never had this before. And I said, what? Well, they've pulled it back. And I go, what does that mean? He goes, well, what they're going to do is they're going to send it to somebody else, and then they're going to get the recording back, and then they're going to transcribe the recording, and then they're going to see if they can release it in full as such. And in 4 weeks' time, we'll let you know. And that was supposed to be, I think it was October, November last year. Well, we're still waiting. So, and I've got Dennis Morissette. He said to me that he found at NARA an interview of Dave Ferry. And he also was promised. Yeah, and he said, I'm going to get it this week. And he's still waiting. And I was talking to him on Facebook Messenger, and I said, forget about it. You're not going to get it. Right. I said, if you get it, if you get it, I'll be very chuffed for you. I definitely want to hear it as well, of course. And it would be quite a catch. But nah, I doubt they'll give that out. But maybe because of the documents coming out, maybe it will happen, and I hope so, because I thought there was out of all the documents that have come out, there isn't not a lot to my interest. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff for John Newman and Malcolm Blunt who do deep CIA and Bill Simpich who do deep CIA research. I think there's plenty for them to delve into. But when it comes to the bit,
I bet John Newman's got an enormous hard on right now with all those files that just came out.
Yeah. Oh, he's been busy downloading. He said on Facebook, but and I mean, every time it's like 3,000 documents, 6,000 documents. So it's quite a job to do.
Yeah, it's a lot of CIA Cuba stuff,
Yeah, there's stuff on Morales, there's stuff on Hunt, there's stuff on Lucien Conein, even Willem Oltmans, a Dutch journalist. There's JM Wave.
Oh, yeah.
But there's not much about the actual crime in Dallas. There's only bits about what ranking requested from the CIA and some correspondence or the FBI between the CIA. For me, the only important document that I also used to update my this interrogations essay with is a November 24th document from J. Edgar Hoover. And that by itself is very interesting because he basically lambasts the Dallas Police Department, obviously for not protecting Oswald. And he claims that he called the Dallas Police and let them know that there were death threats.
Too.
So in that Hoover document, he lambasts, like I said, he lambasts the police, but he also tries to cover his rear. And at the same time, what I thought was a really interesting find is I know everyone always talks about the so-called Katzenbach memo. And what it actually is that Katzenbach copied some of that Oswald being the assassin and he had no accomplices and stuff like that. That bit actually comes from Hoover. And he actually mentions this on the bottom of the second page of this particular document. That by itself I thought was quite interesting. And of course, Hoover is also very busy covering his rear. And on top of that, let me just quote from this document because it's quite important. Oswald having been killed today after our warnings to the Dallas Police Department was inexcusable. It will allow, I'm afraid, a lot of civil rights people to raise a lot of hell because he was handcuffed and had no weapon. There are bound to be some elements of our society who will holler their heads off that his civil rights were violated, which they were. That is quite an admission
I'd say.
from Hoover as such. Now, I just want to get back to the interrogations because we drifted a little bit. I want to talk about the so-called John Reed interrogation technique. Now, this is a technique that, if I'm not mistaken, it was brought up by Bill Kelly at first, but Greg Parker did a much more in-depth essay about it. And John Reed was a lawyer and a former police officer from Chicago. And in 1947, he helped establish modern polygraph techniques, which were called the control question technique. Now, the Reed technique itself uses factual analysis, where each individual is evaluated with respect to specific observations related to the crime. And of course, there's behavior analysis, and which is a non-accusatory question and answer session involving both standard investigative questions and structured behavior-provoking questions to elicit behavior symptoms of truth or deception from the person being interviewed. Now, this technique basically consists of specific elements. Number one is the confrontation. Then there's a theme development. Then there's stopping denials, overcoming objections, getting the suspect's attention. Then the suspect loses resolve. and going through alternatives and bringing the suspect into conversation, and finally, confession. Now, there is no law that is against a police officer lying to you. Yeah? So if you are...
Yeah, they still can.
If you are basically in an interrogation room, the police officer can concoct a story which is complete hooey, but he presents it as truth. And there's no law against that whatsoever. So they can coerce you into giving a statement that you've done it, although you had nothing to do with it. And that brings me back to the Tommy Lee Walker thing. The Tommy Lee Walker aspect is a brilliant example of this Reed interrogation technique. Now, I just rattled off all these bullet points, and of course, every police officer uses that at their own behest. So it's possible that they skip items 2, 3, and 4, for instance, and just go straight at it because they can get away with it. It's a very, very important thing to understand that this is something that was widely in use. This technique was, although it originated in Chicago, it was used nationwide as such. I want to go back to Fritz for a second, because in that respect is that of course there was no tape recorder. The notes were taken, God knows when. Yeah, not at that time. That's for sure. That's also, by the way, confirmed by some of the police officers that Fritz wasn't the guy who basically wrote down a Q&A as such. He wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and they resemble Bookout's notes a lot.
Yeah, well, that is another thing. Sean Murphy pointed that out. That's a really good point to bring up. Bookout himself and the FBI's technique was at that time was that they would handwrite these notes down, and then once they'd done a typed report, they would destroy the handwritten notes as such, and that was common FBI practice. Now, not for Jim Hosty, because Jim Hosty actually paid the price big time because of him talking all that stuff with Jack Revel. And I think I've got documentation plus my writings, I think it accumulates to almost like 20 pages about it. Just that little bit in the garage downstairs. And Hosty's notes survived somehow. He said he didn't keep them. He said he destroyed them. But he in the 70s, he came out with a book. And lo and behold, the notes surfaced as such. Those notes, I've got them in my paper. They're not very coherent at all. Even though he's got like sections made up, the actual phrases in there are in no relation to each other. So the first one has got no relation with the second one, the second no relation with the third one, and so forth. On top of that, Hosty himself gave a alternative version of it, what actually happened as such. Let me just see if I can just dig that out and read it out for you, because this is quite interesting. Pardon the scrolling. Bear with me.
Yeah, I got a copy of his book. It came out in the mid '90s, I think it was. And I remember the interrogation section, and wasn't too terribly much there.
No, that's the thing, and it's only like a few notes. Oh, right here, I've got them. So. His notes himself, one thing is that it mentions a first floor entrance office that could point towards Oswald's position during the assassination. And the other bit is that chose to go home because of confusion.
Yeah.
And that bit is also related to who gave him that choice. And, that's what Ed Ledoux brought up. He goes, who gave him that choice to go home? And Oswald said that Bill Shelley said so, and Bill Shelley denied this, of course. This matter was also broached by Thomas Kelly of the Secret Service. Now, Larry Hapanen wrote quite a piece about this whole thing, about these notes, and he said that there was nothing to suggest any ulterior motive for Hosty to suppress them as such. I tend to go along with him because there's no real smoking gun in it as such. But in his book, Assignment Oswald, it basically goes like this. Okay, now, Lee, you work at the Texas School Book Depository, isn't that right? Yeah, that's right. When did you start working there? About October 15th. What did you do down there? I was just a common laborer. Now, did you have access to all floors of the building? Of course. Tell me what was on each of these floors. The first and second floors of offices, the third and fourth floor are storage, so are the fifth and the sixth. And that's not true. The third and the fourth floor are offices as well. And you were working there today, is that right? Yes. Were you there when the President motorcade went by? Yeah. Where were you when the President went by the book depository? I was eating my lunch in the first floor lunchroom. What time was that? About noon. Were you ever on the second floor around the time the President was shot? Oh, yeah, I went up there to get a bottle of Coca-Cola from the machine for my lunch. You see, this also indicates that he got the Coke before he had his lunch, right? Not after the shooting, before.
Right.
But where were you when the President actually passed your building? On the first floor in the lunchroom. So, and then it says, and you left the depository, isn't that right? Yeah. When did you leave? Well, I figured with all the confusion, there wouldn't be any more work to do that day. Now, that's pretty good, actually. And this is also basically, when you look at the reports, the joint report of Hosty and Bookhout, and you look at the Bookhout report the day after, because the thing is, Hosty paid a massive price because he was pulled out those interrogations, and he was not to be seen again during any of the other interrogations on the 23rd or the 24th as such. And Bookhout basically was the only guy of the FBI at that point who basically wrote the report on the 24th. And that, if you compare the Hosty Bookhout report compared to the Bookhout report, then you're looking at a total contradiction.
Yeah,
and this is where the second floor lunch comes.
Oswald wasn't very happy with James Hosty. I don't believe.
No, that's another thing that he stood up and he got really angry. Overall, is that what they said was that Oswald was overall very calm. Some of them said he was arrogant. But also what Fritz said was that he was trained to go against interrogation. So he must have had training as such. Now
or he was telling the truth.
You know, he was telling the truth, but also he was lying. But the thing was, we also know that he had some sort of connection with intelligence, and they must have trained him one way or another. And especially after being in Russia for 3 years as well, and being interviewed by CIA and being interviewed by FBI and so forth. You know, he's had some experience. Bookhout himself, the good thing is that I happen to have a picture of him without knowing, and it was only that Dennis Morissette put two and two together when he had he found he got a newspaper clipping from Steve Rowe. And Steve Rowe basically gave that to Dennis, and he goes, that's Bookhout. And it was a newspaper clipping from, I think, 67 or 68. And then he saw one of my pictures where there's a guy smoking a pipe inside room 317, robbery and homicide. And that's James Bookhout. So he's only been, I think it was about four or 5 months ago, basically being ID'd as such. The FBI had its fingers everywhere. When you look at Hosty and Bookhout inside the interrogation, but then, of course, there was Vincent Drain, and a lot of people don't know about him. But Drain was basically glued to Henry Wade and Jesse Curry. He stood behind Henry Wade during the the press conference, one of the press conferences. And there's also pictures of him in the corridor just before that press conference as such. And he just stands, he's wearing a hat, and he just stands. He's just seen right behind Wade and Curry. And there's a couple of shots of that I put in there as well. And on top of that, Hoover had FBI informants. And one of the FBI informants was Harry Holmes. And Harry Holmes was the U.S. Postal Inspector. And he claimed he was in and out the building on the 22nd and on the 23rd, although there's no corroboration of that. But he was there on the 24th. And this is the problem for the whole case. And good for us, bad for them, for the deniers, the lone nutters, is that Holmes wanted to be part of the Old Boy network, but he wasn't. And on top of that, he blabbed way too much. He gave the game away, especially regarding the second floor lunchroom encounter. The actual interrogation itself, I already wrote about in the second floor lunchroom encounter fakery. There's got Fritz book out, Hosty, and Holmes written about in great detail, and he gave the gig away basically with regards Oswald's position being on the first floor instead of inside the second floor lunchroom. From the Old Boy network regarding the coppers, there are quite a few police officers, and I spent quite a bit of time, and also thanks to Steve Rowe and Dennis Morissette, managed to ID a lot of people. And, I'll just give you some names. We got C.W. Brown, we got Charles Doherty, we got Elmer Boyd. Elmer Boyd's still alive, by the way, just like Lavelle, of course, Jim Lavelle. Then you got Billy Senkel, got Gus Rose. We'll talk about him in a minute. Mm-hmm. Then Richard Stovall. You've got Richard Sims, and we'll talk about him in a minute. Adamczyk, Hank Moore, and Joe Cody. And they all were either involved with transportation or between the lineups or the jail to the interrogation room. But there's also a few that actually sat in on the interrogation, because we know that Oswald sat at first cuffed with his hands behind his back. Then he got his hands cuffed in front of him. But he had a police officer sitting at each side next to him. One of those police officers was Elmer Boyd. And another guy who was involved heavily was Richard Sims. And if you read their testimony, it's laughable, because they both have a case of amnesia, especially when it comes to what did Oswald say. If you go through the Warren Commission testimony, and I dragged and dropped the pages of the Warren Commission testimony, or copied and pasted the actual text, and they've got a really bad case of amnesia. And Harold Weisberg wrote, especially about Richard Sims, you ask why Richard Sims is actually a police officer, because he doesn't remember anything, nothing. It's just shocking. You really ask yourself and go, what on earth is going on here? This guy says, I don't recall. I have no recollection of that. I don't know what he asked. And, were you there when he asked all the questions? Yeah. Well, what was being asked? Oh, I don't know. I have no idea. And this is how it goes on. And this is the whole thing. You can talk, you've got them two, but you've got Gus Rose as well. Now, Gus Rose was, of course, did one of the first interrogations, and then he was sent off to search the house, at the Payne's house.
Right.
And,
they were running Frazier back and forth too.
Yeah, there's in my paper I've got video footage and some good pictures of Frazier and Lily Mae Randall actually leaving the room 317, and shot through the window, and also from the corridor when they just come out of that room. But also, I don't know if you're familiar with the documentary Thin Blue Line. And this is a documentary from the late 80s. And this is a really shocking documentary with regards injustice from the Dallas police. I think it's on YouTube. Just type it in. And Gus Rose comes off really bad. Again, as somebody who just basically has pumped out a statement and just shoves it right in front of the suspect. and basically says, "Go on, sign that," as such. And you could see that whole approach is very similar to what Fritz did, with Frazier as such. Just have a statement, shove it in front of him, and say, "Sign that," or otherwise, you're going to get whacked one way or another with my hands or with a bat or by somebody else. And which is just quite interesting that this so-called technique, between quotation marks, is actually being applied as such. In that case, you can always claim a 98% clearance rate if you do it like that, of course,
Oh, sure.
So then, of course, the Secret Service comes in because the president has been whacked. And what I found the most surprising bit of the Secret Service bit, there are a few agents that basically walked in. And, of course, we're talking about Forrest Sorrells, who was the lead agent. But he talks to Oswald at 4 p.m. by himself. Because Sorrells arrived at the Texas School Book Depository, first of all. He stayed there. He said he was surprised that the building wasn't sealed up yet. And he didn't get there until just before 1 o'clock. So almost half an hour after the deed, the building still wasn't sealed. Although DPD claimed it was. But because he just walked in through a back entrance, just like that. Now, the Texas School Book Depository, if you look at the drawings, it's got several exits on the side and on the north side of the building. And he just walked in. Now, he didn't record it, nor did he write anything down. Now, the notes that did survive are like half a page of a little notepad. And they were actually found by accident in the Warren Commission notes because the bottom half was regarding Jack Ruby. Because Sorrells talked to Jack Ruby quite quick after he had snuffed Oswald. But there are some scribbles, and these notes, they don't reflect the amount of time spent during the interrogations. You see, Sorrells was there from the afternoon until Oswald was sent to bed,
right.
in his cell. Nor is it on the 23rd, and he was there on the 24th as well, in the morning. So, and the whole bit, that the way it's written on that piece of paper, it's nothing. That would be like a 2-minute conversation between you and me, summarization as such. It also looks like it looks like the page. There's a page before that. There's probably another. There's probably 1 or 2 pages before that. That's what it looks like. Now, then you've got Inspector David Kelly, Thomas Kelly. And he actually he writes quite a big report. I think it's 3 pages, if I'm not mistaken. And in that report, let me just quote that quick. I'll have to scroll. Sorry.
Oh, you're right. I guess we'll have to wait till 2039 for the rest of the Warren Commission records to be sealed.
Yeah, I have no idea whether that's going to happen, but because the way things disappear. In this report, actually, I've got 2 reports, because one of them was written by him, where they actually did a reenactment of the second floor lunchroom encounter of a suspect, basically, of an agent actually leaving the so-called sniper's nest, dropping the rifle and going down the stairs, and they timed it at 2.5 minutes, which is just a complete joke, because that goes against everything that basically the commission brought forward, because they said it was 75 or 90 seconds as such. Now, Kelly basically asks him some questions. And in the passage on the second page, he says, I asked him if he viewed the parade, and he said he had not. I then asked him if he had shot the president, and he said he had not. I asked him if he had shot Governor Connolly, and he said he had not. Now, Fritz's notes, the handwritten notes, corroborate everything except I asked him if he viewed the parade, and he said he had not. As a matter of fact, Kelly is the only one that actually says that Oswald did not view the parade. He's the only person. Not Bookhout says this, Hopsey or Fritz or anyone else, basically. Kelly's report also confirms Fritz's notes with regard to eating lunch in the Domino Room and the mention of Junior Jarman and the short little Negro boy, which in all likelihood is Harold Norman. Also, he even matches the lunch description that coincides with Fritz's note as well. So from that, you've got Secret Service, you've got FBI, you've got DPD, but there were other people there as well. And this is a bit of a problem because we know that they had U.S. Marshals in there, and they had ATF agents in there. Now, Robert Nash is a U.S. Marshal, and I've got some pictures of him, and that's about it. I have been trying to find his notes, but I haven't been lucky as such yet. Regarding the ATF, there is a guy called Frank Ellsworth. Now, Frank Ellsworth is written about quite a bit in Dick Russell's book, The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Right.
And he said he was present during the first interrogations, and he stated that he did not recall seeing any panic in Oswald. He appeared to be awfully pleased with himself, which is just rubbish. But anyway, with a smug look on his face, as Oswald was surrounded by 14 agents and officers, and he didn't look disturbed at all. He had the cat ate the canary look on his face the whole time. Right, so that's another version of being arrogant, obviously. I haven't found any written evidence available of ATF agents being present during these interrogations. You know, in Fritz's notes, he actually mentions that Bouckaert and Hosty are in there, and that Sorrells is present as well. But he doesn't make any mention of ATF agent. However, when it comes to the search through the Texas School Book Depository, there is a mention of Frank Ellsworth. And I think it's in a report by, I think it's Billy Senkel, if I'm not mistaken. In Sims and Boyce joint report, he's basically mentioned alongside with another officer from the Alcohol Tax Department. It should be firearms, but anyway, that's how it's written down. Then there are highway patrolmen. They've been photographed as well. They're the guys wearing uniforms and big stats and hats, and they've got these belts on. Where they're also ones that goes crossways or in front of your chest. I've got some pictures in there, but other than that, well, absolutely no information whatsoever of these guys. I doubt they were also inside of that particular office of Fritz where they were interrogating Oswald. I don't think they got the access. So I'm really trying to find out with regards to Robert Nash, because Nash was inside that office of Fritz. Going back to the Secret Service, there's three other guys that get a mention by me. One is Dave B. Grant. Another who he writes, but he doesn't say that he was inside, but he was like at police headquarters and assisting Sorrells and Kelly. I must not forget that Kelly wasn't in Dallas on that day. He had to fly in, so he didn't arrive until like late in the afternoon or early evening. And that's the same thing with all the other guys. Then there's a guy called Mike Howard. You can see some video of him where he gives a talk. And he's probably the biggest disinfo clown of the whole bunch. It's laughable that what he's writing down. He does say that he denied that emphatically up and down. They knew he did it, but he never did admit it, Howard said. He was very arrogant. Here we go, that word. Howard himself was involved with shielding Marina Oswald after the assassination, and with Dave B. Grant, I think, as well. And then there's a guy called Charles Kunkel as well. I've got him recognized in a photo from the Dallas Times Herald.
I thought that name sounded familiar with.
He was involved.
Marina, yeah.
Yeah, he was also involved with the detail. That whole thing is a chapter by itself. But they basically they were protecting Marina on orders of LBJ. They wanted to make sure that nothing would happen to him. So that's roughly the participants. The documentation that I found so far, of course, is all in the paper. I see myself as a non-writer, so I put as much of the original documentation and the interviews in there as I can, just like the second floor lunchroom encounter. I give my opinion on bits this here and there, but to me it's like the evidence that I've gathered in the shape of newspaper articles, affidavits, interviews, like Malcolm Blunt gave me William Manchester's interview notes. So they're very interesting because they're not exactly the same as what's written in the book. So they're definitely a really interesting read, and I think that's about it for the first part. Just to talk about these guys, I just, if you're interested in this, if the listener is interested in it, I suggest you download the PDF from either the Dealey Plaza UK website. There's a link on the front page if you scroll down a little bit, and there's a link if you go to my prayer-man.com. If you go to the diary section on the right-hand side, there's a link towards it, which is called Anatomy of Oswald's Interrogations as such. Now, for our next talk, I'm going to talk about the legal aspect of it. We're going to talk about Henry Wade, Bill Alexander, Barefoot Sanders. We're going to talk about the guys that try to represent him, the ACLU or the DCLU. We're going to talk about a guy called Charles Webster, very interesting guy, a bit of a mystery as well. We're going to talk especially about all the videos that are actually around of Oswald, asking for his legal rights, lawyers, pleading his innocence, you name it, basically. Maybe we should get the audio ripped out of that, and we're going to talk about the lineups a little bit because that was a farce by itself. And I'm going to tell everyone why Oswald wasn't arraigned for the murder of JFK, even though people claim he was. He wasn't. He was only arraigned for the Tippit murder, and this is the problem. They didn't have anything that could make it stick. They thought they had enough to make it stick on the Tippit murder, but they didn't have enough. They were worried. Fritz was worried. He said it to Lavelle that he was worried that he couldn't make it stick.
Or get a confession.
Yeah. The so-called top interrogator and, him and Bill Decker, for instance. Yeah. Oh, by the way, the stuff I forgot. The sheriff's office. You have Bill Decker, who was a legend as Fritz, regarded as a legend as such. But, of course, at the sheriff's office as well was Roger Craig. I believe Roger Craig when it comes to Oswald's departure from the Texas School Book Depository because of the 15 minutes as such. You see, the other day, somebody told me something, and I thought, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, I think everybody pretty much believes that the power was cut off during and just after the assassination. The lift wasn't working. Right. You know what, Rob? If the lift isn't working, the Coca-Cola machine doesn't work either.
This is true.
If the Coca-Cola machine doesn't work either, how the hell is he getting that Coke out of that fridge? Walks down, and then nobody sees him with that Coke. And what does he do? Does he walk out with that Coke, that so-called phantom Coke? Or does he guzzle it down in front of everybody? Now, if somebody did that, that would have been noticed by at least one person when they were walking back in. I'm trying to find out more about, and if anyone listens and has information to this, is about the social setting of Dallas. I mean, I've got these crime figures, and I've read about the racism bit, this, that, and the other, but I'd like to know more about what Dallas police was actually like, because, of course, the way they present it is anything but the truth as such, because I've already given you like a few examples with regards Tommy Lee Walker, Buell Frazier, and the fact that they couldn't break Oswald as such. They just failed on that aspect. If anyone has any information regarding that, then they should email me. And the email address is meetthelonegunman@gmail.com. And I would appreciate a lot if you have any links to anything or books or know about anything whatsoever. I really would love to get my hands on it, because the social aspect of it are actually determining the bigger picture of it all. And overall, I find that Dallas police lied their fucking ass off. I can't describe it any other way. They basically lied. I mean, Fritz as well in his statement, he basically said that Oswald usually had lunch on the second floor. And that's total rubbish. The domino room on the first floor, that was the lunchroom for the workers and the blacks.
Right, the book company employees normally ate on the second floor, right?
Exactly, because it was much tidier. Because if you look at the pictures, right?
Much whiter.
Oh, it's whiter, but it's not whiter and whiter, but also definitely whiter. And it was much neater looking. The nice chairs. I mean, the thing. If you look at the pictures of the Texas School Book Depository that are in the Warren Commission report, then this whole first floor is just a dusty mess and old furniture, and my God, it just looks like a crap hole. And if you look at the second floor, and also people like, is it Harold Norman? Harold Norman said the second floor lunchroom was for office workers and management only. And I doubt that these manual workers, these guys who took their shirts off and were working in T-shirts, right, and hung their shirts either in the basement or in the domino room, would have lunch in the second floor lunchroom as such. They weren't allowed. There's a class divide regarding that matter. There's a lot of people that forget about, but these are the elements that basically put things into the right perspective. Of course, Billy Lovelady and Oswald got their cokes. They probably got their cokes together, or maybe just after each other. But after that, they were supposed to leave and not sitting down in that room. The whole thing about Carolyn Arnold saying that she saw him sitting there having lunch is absolute rubbish. It's just rubbish. It would never happen.
Yeah, those guys were wearing their suits and ties, and the women were in their dresses, and it was a very office-y type setting.
Exactly.
You know, and from what I've read about when they first moved into the School Book Depository, you know, the summer of '63, because everybody was in the Dow Tex, and they were using, well, at least the book companies were, and they were using the other warehouse as the main warehouse. Yeah. They wanted to consolidate operations, move all of the book companies in, and some of the warehousing. And they managed to refurbish, like the second, third, and fourth floor. Yeah. The rest of it was just as it was when they got it. Yeah. You know, it used to be a dirty, empty warehouse, you know, an air conditioner factory or whatever it was before that. And, you know, the floors were stained. That's why they were supposedly redoing the floors, you know, on the fifth floor, sixth floor, etc. And, you know, like you said, I'm sure the first floor was still in a lot of disrepair and very dirty and dingy. But the second, third, and fourth floors were very nice. They were already remodeled. And all the book companies had moved from their Dow Tex over to the School Book Depository, you know, by the time of the assassination.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's that to me is quite an important factor to get that whole social element, because that sets the tone of what's actually going on. And then when you read these statements, you just go, well, that strikes me as really odd, you know, of Oswald sitting there in the second floor lunchroom and having lunch. It just doesn't rhyme at all, because like I said, you compare the pictures and you compare it with the statements, then, you know, something isn't right. And there's just, you know, not just the Dallas police lied. I think a lot of employees of the Texas School Book Depository were economical with the truth. Yeah. I think the blacks were coerced. You know, they knew better. They weren't going to stick their neck out. And by the way, who sticks their neck out for an employee that's been around for about 5 to 6 weeks?
Nobody. You know?
Nobody. Hardly anyone, besides the workers, knew him partially. The office workers knew him partially, only from sight or maybe from interaction, from getting change.
Especially of being accused of killing the president. I mean, you got to put it in the correct context. If you're, one of the black workers or any other workers there, really, you want to distance yourself from this guy as much as possible. I don't know nothing. I didn't see nothing.
I've got an idea about this whole thing, and to add on, because here's the thing. Because they couldn't stick it about the president's murder, and at first, Oswald was basically arrested for Tippett's murder, and that's how it went. You see, when James Take was it had his affidavit taken by Gus Rose. Gus Rose said to him, he shot a cop. Now, the cop killing happens somewhere completely different than the Texas School Book Depository. When the Texas School Book Depository workers are being interviewed at that time, and we're talking Lovelady, we're talking Bonnie Ray Williams, Denny Garcia Arce, these guys.
Yeah.
I bet that they're basically being told that Oswald shot a cop. There's no talk about this whole JFK thing at all. No. Because as far as I'm concerned, if they'd said that, right, like this guy shot the president, right, some of them would have said like, how can that be? Because I saw him standing on the stairs.
Right.
Or I saw him in the domino room as such. But when he's basically been stigmatized by the fact that he shot a cop. Now, it's the worst kind, of course, to kill a cop. I think it's even worse back then than it is now,
Right.
And I think that is a factor that needs to be considered as well. I'm not saying it's true, but I think for the fact that, Fritz said to Lavelle, have you got enough on him for Tippit? Yes, I do. Because of 3-4 so-called witnesses had ID'd him and so forth. And that puts a complete different strain on the whole Oswald being guilty matter, And I think that they do the president thing was either not going to happen, which it didn't because he didn't get arraigned at all. More about that in the second half. And that they basically just got it stuck on Tippit because they arraigned him on Tippit, early evening as such. Yeah. And that's also when the second statements were taken. Lovelady had the statement taken at about 2-3 o'clock. And the second one was taken about 6 or 7 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken. Shelley did a second statement as well. Because if you read their first statement, it's got absolutely nothing to do with Oswald whatsoever. And this is while he's brought in. You see, this is a really funny thing. Oswald's been brought in, but they're not saying a word about Oswald at all. And that's when Shelley is there, because Shelley recognized him and says he works at the Texas School Book Depository. Lovelady sees him being frog marched past him while he's sitting inside the office, right?
Yeah.
And in these affidavits that they basically put down, there is not a word about Oswald whatsoever. Nothing. It's later on in the day. That's when actually they basically start blubbing about Oswald being such and how long he's been there working, this, that, and the other, and when was the last time you saw him, etc., etc. They deny his alibi as such. And that's the thing. That's the main thing what the DPD, the FBI, and all the others did. They denied him his alibi as such. Huh.
Yeah, I mean, you can't argue with it. And that's why I love having you on, Bart. I mean, and folks out there, you can see why this guy is the researcher of the year last year for Lancer. The way you compile information and put it together and make it make sense in a logical manner is just second to none. I mean, we have all the information, and we've had it for years. But to actually put it all together and see what fits and see what's bullshit, that's the game.
Just look at me as some deluded stamp collector who's trying to. There's nothing else what I do, because the only thing I do is basically I'm trying to get all the available information. Now, of course, most of the statements have already been put out, but it's amazing what how many interviews, like Roy Truly gave quite a few interviews after. I know he talked to Barry Ernest, he talked to William Manchester, but he talked to Holland McCombs, he talked to a few other newspapers, Ken Biffle. When you just add it all up, Roy Truly was a blabbermouth. And but it's just a matter of collecting it all, finding it, collecting it, and basically putting it all side by side. Even like recently I got a Roy Truly interview where he basically claims that Oswald ate his lunch in the second floor lunchroom. It's just total rubbish. It's a bare-faced lie. But then again, Truly was lying left, right, and center anyway, especially during his Warren Commission testimony. And this is another thing I'm going to add to my second floor lunchroom encounter essay. This is going to be the third update. And that's the fact that the lunchroom encounter wasn't put forward until the 23rd. The first news report was just before lunchtime. It was at 10 to 1 at the Associated Press, basically put out a bulletin where it was basically said that there was an encounter in the second floor lunchroom. So between 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 22nd till 10 to 1 on the 23rd, there isn't a word about this. Now, when you start going back through Truly's affidavits, the majority are done on the 23rd, and that's understandable because Roy Truly was, of course, all day at the Texas School Book Depository. Now, there's one FBI affidavit where he does mention this, and it's where he mentions the second floor lunchroom encounter, and where it says that it was dictated on the 22nd. Now, this could have only been done either really late in the evening, or FBI sent an agent to the Texas School Book Depository as such. I don't have the answer to that yet, but there's definitely not a word about this whole second floor lunchroom encounter until the 23rd. Yeah. And that's quite interesting, because that would have been Baker would have made a mention of that, and which he didn't, because Baker said in his first affidavit that it was on the 3rd and the 4th floor. That by itself is already enough to basically discount the encounter. And especially also while Baker, I've mentioned this before, Baker sits in the same room while Oswald's being interrogated. And it's Baker also who mentions in his HSCA interview in the 70s that once he's accused of killing the president, he says, "That's absurd. I want a lawyer. I want a lawyer."
Yeah, I love it. And they can find this, they can go download the PDF for that also at Dealey Plaza UK, right? And your website?
Yes, both papers are now available through my website. You can go to the front page, and they're mentioned there. If you just scroll down a little bit, they're mentioned there. They've got yellow links. You can click on them, and it will take you. Those are on my site. Or you can go to the Dealey Plaza UK website, which is a fun group I'm part of, and I'm going to be doing a talk about this in April in Canterbury. It's 2.5 days of just pure JFK stuff, so it's good fun. And you can download it from both sites, so go for it.
And you can go back and listen to episode 124 of this very show to hear Bart talking about it here on the radio as well.
Debunking the second floor lunchroom encounter.
Yep, that's episode 124.
Yeah, that was fun.
Definitely. And so was this, Bart. And I can't wait to have you back, buddy. And we'll get back into all this interrogation goodness. And I guess in about a week or two, people out there, look for it, listen for it, and I'll be back. Bart, thank you so much for stopping by again and kicking off the Lone Gunman podcast again, my friend.
It's good fun.
Most definitely. Hey, you hang on the line for me, okay? I'm going to talk us out.
All right.
Everybody, it's great to be back. It feels good. The time is right. This sumbitch is in the can, beamed up the satellite down directly to your ears, people. This is your boy. Peace.